Thank you so much, everyone, for having me here in the IIS seminar series. It's a great honor and pleasure to chair this session. We have our own Rafael Carranza, our own Joaquin Prieto, and our own Kristen Zane on the slides today. We're going to talk about job loss and earnings inequality, a topic that I'm personally interested in job loss and unemployment. So I don't think that you need to have introductions of who Rafael and Joaquin or Kristen is, but if there's any need, I'll let them to introduce themselves rather than taking up much more valuable time here. So I'll be sitting here and then keeping the minutes, and our regular presentation is going to take approximately, as I recall, is up like 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then there will be 20 minutes questions at the end. They are happy to take clarification questions as they go along. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you all very much for coming. My name is Kirsten Sainbuff. I'm the British Academy Global Professor at the Inequalities Institute, and I just want to say 2 words before Rafael actually does the presentation. So those of you in the room who know my work know that I work on job quality and measuring job quality in particular. But the reason why this British Academy project exists on job quality is because many years ago, I started working on the Chilean unemployment insurance, and it became very obvious the extent to which in developing countries, precarious employment undermines social security systems. If they're trying to build them up, it makes them downright impossible. And in advanced economies, we see the same thing. Poor quality employment really makes it difficult to sustain in the long term social security systems. So I've been working on the unemployment insurance system in Chile for a very long time. In fact, Rafael, Joaquin, and myself, we've done a couple of papers already that show how this plays out in the administrative data. So that shows specifically how does a different type of job, how do particular types of jobs then play out in the insurance system? Who is more insured, who is less insured? And the conclusions of those papers are basically that the precarious workers who most need insurance and support are the least supported, and those workers who have the best quality jobs are the most supported by unemployment insurance. Now that's sort of an analysis of how these 2 things interact, but what we're doing in this paper is taking it a step further and looking more at the inequalities within the system, and we're actually looking at the best jobs in the Chilean labour market and looking how they are affected by job losses. And so I just wanted to sort of give you this caveat to begin with, because this paper is not about the majority of workers in Chile. It's about the workers who we can see in the administrative database who have the better quality jobs, and then what happens to them when they lose their jobs. And as Rafael will tell you, inequality is compounded by job losses. You know, the workers with the best jobs, again, are the least affected. So I really just wanted to bring these 2 things together. So we have a new aspect now of inequality that we're bringing into this debate. But already in the context of the debate, we know that the social security systems aren't really compensating for these inequalities that are inherent in the labour market. So with that, I wanted to pass you over to Rafael, who's going to be presenting your work.
Oh, thanks. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming to be here, to the people online as well. I'm not gonna introduce the paper again, so I'm gonna jump right in. This paper is part of a larger literature on the cost of labor displacement. The idea here is studying how unemployment changes can affect workers, not only in the time they take to recover, but also in the jobs they find afterwards, after the period of unemployment. And there are several reasons for which firms can change the level of employment. There's economic crisis, there's technological change, regulatory policies, and so on. And while the literature highlights that there are positive effects of this, particularly due to potential gains in innovation and productivity, there's the adverse cost of laying off workers and the transition that follows for them. If you look at the literature for the global north, you see that among those workers that do lose a job, there's a large reduction in earnings, and this effect is persistent over time. This is because these effects have different time horizons. In the short term, we're talking about unemployment, so people actually don't have a job But over the long term, you see that there's wage losses that happen because of the new jobs, because they end up having lower earnings than before. Now, what we do in the paper is we study the earnings dynamics following a job loss. We study how income falls and then recovers over time. And we look at the cost of losing a stable and formal employment. As Kirsten said, because we're using administrative data, we're going to be looking at formal jobs. And we talk about stable employment because we are looking at those jobs with relatively large durations, which is something I'm going to discuss when we get to the data. We go beyond the average effect, not only looking at averages, but also looking at the effects across the earnings distribution. And we look at the overall impact by using a summary measure, particularly the Gini coefficient. And as I said, we're going to be using administrative data for Chile, a country that some of you have seen in previous presentations, that has fairly recently become a high-income country 10 years ago, but still has relatively high levels of informal employment. Around 30% of the labor force is informal in Chile, which is relatively low if you look at Latin America, but high when compared to Europe, for example. And there's also high earnings and income inequality, even within the formal sector, as I'm going to show you now. In terms of the findings, we see that on average, those workers that lose their jobs suffer a loss of roughly 30% of their average earnings in the first month of separation. There's a recovery, of course, but you see a return to pre-termination levels following 1.5 years, roughly. If you look at the bottom, you see that wage losses are much larger and also recovery times are much longer. On the other hand, if you look at the top, losses are quite similar to the average, around 40%, but there's very quick recoveries, anywhere from 6 to 9 months. You see that they've recovered their pre-termination in earnings. These findings show that job losses reinforce earnings inequality in the formal labor market. If you look at the Gini, for example, you see that there's a relatively large impact in the short run, anywhere from the first month of termination all the way to 1.5 years. And there's small but persistent impacts on the Gini. So inequality remains high, although with very small effects. Now, in terms of the contributions, to the literature, we think of two main ones. The first one is that we look at the impact of job losses across the earnings distribution. We're not looking at the average anymore, or only the average. And we need to understand what's the contribution behind these distributional effects is that we can learn whether these dynamics reinforce or not existing inequalities in the labor market. But also we can think of better design and implementation in terms of redistribution. So unemployment insurance, but also social protection in the general sense. The second contribution is that we provide evidence for the global south. Most of these studies have looked at the north, particularly the US and Europe. And these studies, unfortunately, cannot be directly extrapolated to the case of Chile or other countries in the region, because they look at countries where informality is low, where there's relatively strong social protection systems, but also in terms of the type of labor market. You see in Europe, longer tenures, lower rotation compared to Chile and the rest of the region. So the rest of the paper, the rest of the presentation follows a very standard outline. I'm going to talk about the background, the methods, some results, and conclusions. Now, in terms of the literature, there's, as I said, very limited evidence for the global south. There's a couple of papers looking at displacement using administrative data. Veronica Amarante, for example, looks at Uruguay using unemployment insurance data. They find somewhat similar results to ours. On average, workers lose around 40% of their wages. And after a year, losses are still positive and they exceed 14%. David Kaplan and others look at Mexico using social security data, and they study the effect of displacement based on timing. So whether you lost your job during an economic boom or an economic crisis. And they find that displacement could potentially be positive during good times because workers are able to switch to better jobs that they would not find in other contexts. One point we highlight in the paper is that these studies do not make a clear distinction between displacement, so forced separations, and voluntary separations, which is one of the things we try to address in this paper. You can also see literature outside of the region for heterogeneous effects. These are differences across groups, but also across the distribution. For example, you have the case of Finland, where they compare how displacement impacts workers depending on where they are in the earnings distribution. They find higher impacts among those at the bottom of the distribution. There's also evidence for the US in which they focus on the type of transition workers have. They find, for example, that displacement has a very small impact among those workers that are able to switch from a full-time job to another full-time job. But there's a significant proportion of workers that experience large earning losses, so even larger than the average. And this is partly explained because of the job search period. These are workers that take a substantial amount of time in finding a new job, which is why their earnings are below the average. Now, why are we interested on the distributional dimension of this? We are looking at how these effects change across the distribution, as I said, because we know from previous evidence that both the nature and the size of these effects changes across the distribution. And this is particularly relevant for workers with low earnings because they could be trapped in vicious cycles of bad jobs. So switching from one bad job to another, both because the probability of unemployment is high, but also because the probability of finding a low-paying job is also high. And that persistent, if it exists, requires policies focused on them. So this is relevant for designing labor market policies that improve work conditions on the one hand, but also are aimed to reduce earnings inequality. So jumping into the economic strategy, I'm not going to go into too much details on the methods, but this methodology is based on the work by Jacobson and others in 1993, in which you get this type of regressions when you have on the left-hand side, the earnings for a given worker on a given period in time, could be a month, could be a quarter, could be a year. You have fixed effects, in this case, individual and time. You have a bunch of covariates. Typically, these are characteristics of the previous job, the one you just lost. And this is the component we're interested in. This D is a binary variable that takes the value 1 if you lost your job k months before or after how far away you are from losing your job. This k could be negative, which means that you haven't lost your job yet, you're before losing your job, or it could be positive, which means that we're looking at months after losing your job. And particularly, we are interested in these delta parameters, which is the change in the average wage k months from a job loss relative to those that haven't lost one. And ideally, in this literature, you want to control for a large period before job separations. This is an issue given the nature of the labor market in Chile, and that's also something I'm going to discuss when we get to the data. Now, you can also go.
Sorry, as a chair, I'm not sure whether I should be interrupting, but just a clarification here, the covariates about the post-job characteristics are also anticipated in advance. So the time script over there means that we are observing these characteristics before the job loss happens.
Yes. Yeah.
So okay, good.
So it could be characteristics of your job in terms of the duration. Yeah. So yeah, you're observing them before you lose your job.
So there should be a K then there.
A K for
it's not good.
Oh no, because it doesn't change over time.
So there are only the fixed characteristics that you're looking at.
Yeah. So and you have them on a monthly basis.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, you could think of this as job characteristics rather than IT. You could have a J for that specific job, for example. Yeah. So you can go beyond the mean to study quantiles. This would be the same setup. Again, we're interested in this parameter. You can get 1 for each quantile, anywhere from 1 to 100, for example. The problem with this approach, using standard quantile regressions, is that you are looking at conditional quantiles, conditional covariates. And of course, that's a problem because you want to look at the distribution of wages, not the conditional one. So the alternative is to use unconditional quantile regression, which is what we are using in this paper. We do this using recentered influence functions, RIF. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details behind it, but these recentered influence functions, particularly the influence functions, are functions that are originally created to assess the sensitivity of a given feature. So for example, how does the mean change when, say, education increases by 1 year, or how does the median change, or how does the Gini coefficient or the variance? You can have any sort of feature of a given distribution, and you can assess through this method how it changes when you see changes in covariates. I'm going to talk later about which features are we looking at, but basically, as you can see, you have the same setup we had before. There's previous applications for this type of approach. Chico, for example, has one looking at determinants of inequality in Brazil and how inequality decreased over time. There's also research on the impact of immigration in Luxembourg, wealth transition in the UK, and there's even more now. We're looking at this approach. So the case of Chile, I mean, I might be biased, but I find it interesting. So it's been cited as a successful case of development in some cases, given economic growth and so on. However, as you probably know, it's also a country where income inequality is high and persistent. We had Roberto speak a couple of months ago about the protests in Chile, which have something to do with this income inequality. It also shares some similarities to developed countries in terms of labor market institutions. You see, we have unemployment insurance, minimum wages, but the main characteristic is that we still have a very underdeveloped labor market. So short durations, high rotation, high polarization, that doesn't necessarily translate well to the type of policies we have. And the good thing for our work is that Chile has access to very good longitudinal administrative data, which is what we're going to use here. Concretely, we are looking at the Chilean unemployment insurance database. This is a monthly register for all formal workers in the private sector. This is roughly 50% of the labor force. It excludes, of course, the informal workers, public sector workers, also employed and the self-employed. It began in 2002 with automatic registration, which means that any new contract that was signed starting on 2002 was part of the database. That, of course, means that it took some time for it to become representative of the labor force. Previous research we've done shows that this happened around 2010, so this database became relatively representative of the formal workforce starting in 2010. And we use a publicly available 3% sample to do our analysis. There used to be a 5% sample, which is no longer available, probably because of the large size of it, but this is what we're using.
Chico.
Yeah. Question, clarification on this 3%.
Yeah.
So you're going to use a panel, right? Is it 3% at one point and then they follow those same people?
It's based on you're sampling on individuals. So basically, if you're part of the 3% sample, you're going to be.
They don't take 3% every year.
No,
that would destroy it.
It's based on a given period. You follow them over time. There's, of course, renewal. So if new workers are entering the database, you're going to find them. Sorry?
They do come in.
They do come in. So you have new entrances over time. Otherwise, it wouldn't be representative over time. So the composition changes as well.
If somebody drops out, it's not because of sampling, it's because they've left the.
Yes. So if they disappear, they left the formal labor market. And then we're going to talk about that later, but it's one of the issues.
But just tag along, if they left, they might be leaving your sample because they also become self-employed and
yes,
workers.
That's exactly the last slide and the presentation is about that. We don't know what they're doing once they leave the formal labor market. So indeed, in the paper, we don't talk about unemployment, we talk about non-contribution periods because we don't really know what they're doing. In terms of restrictions to the sample, we're gonna focus on January 2010 all the way to November 2019. January 2010, because as I said, this is where the sample became roughly representative of the labor force, of the formal labor force. And November 2019, because as you probably know, there were a series of protests in Chile that started in October 2019, where unemployment rose very quickly. So we want to exclude that period. Age is restricted to 15 all the way to 65. This is mostly to restrict workers over 65 that appear in the database. And we have a duration restriction. So as I said, this approach requires you to control for a relatively long period of time before losing your job. Typically, if you look at studies for the US, for example, you have at least 3 years of duration. So we do have a subsample for that. The problem is that given the short durations of most jobs in Chile, you're excluding a substantial part of the labor force. That's why we have a second subsample where we restrict those jobs that have at least 1 year rather than 3 years. And those are the results I'm going to show you. Fortunately, the two show very consistent results. But yeah, I'm going to focus on the 12 months as I'm going to show you now. In terms of additional restrictions, We have only workers that report income at least once a year. This is to say that they appear in the database at least once a year. Basically, this is just to include people that have some frequent relationship with the formal labor market. And this is the way we try to exclude those voluntary transitions into better jobs. What we do is we drop all immediate job transitions, that is anyone that had no unemployment periods, basically that jumps from one job to another, but at the same time had an income increase of at least 25%. We are excluding those basically because we use that definition as a proxy of voluntary transitions. So people switching to better jobs immediately. This could be a bit problematic. We know there's evidence, for example, of people moving voluntarily into new jobs where their income is lower, for example, because they have potential better trajectories or because they're sacrificing income to get better labor conditions. But this is the restriction we're gonna stick with because we don't have much information on those other dimensions. So this is just to show you the distribution of durations of the unemployment, just to show you this idea that there are quite a large number of jobs that are short term. The database has two types of contracts. You have open-ended contracts, fixed-term contracts, and this is showing you the distribution of those durations. You can see that if we look at more than 3 years, so what the methodology originally intended, we would be looking at 40% of open-ended contracts and less than 8% of fixed-term contracts, which is why we focused on the 1-year restriction. In which case we're looking at roughly 75% of the open-ended contracts and 25% of fixed-term contracts. This is reinforcing what Kirsten said. We're looking at within the formal market, we're looking at the relatively better jobs, those that have long durations. So that's a group that we're focusing on. And here's just some descriptive statistics to get an idea of how the sample changes once you include this duration restriction. You see, for example, that of course, the share of open-ended contracts increases. This is by contraction. Age also increases anywhere between 3 and 4 years, depending on which sample you use. The share of women goes down. But perhaps more importantly for our analysis, we see that the more restrictions you put in terms of duration, the higher the income, not only as the average, but across the distribution. So you see that anywhere for the 25, the median and the 75 percentile, you see that income earnings, are larger once you include this duration restriction. And again, this is just showing you the same, but throughout the distribution. I'm not going to go into too much details, but what it's showing you is that once you cap based on duration, income is higher across most of the distribution, except perhaps this, the very, very top. So just to recap, this is the empirical estimation we're going to be using. We're going to focus on that term. This is what we're going to plot here. We're using brief regression to look at different features of the distribution. So we're going to be replacing the mean income. For other features of the distribution, particularly, we're going to look at percentiles and conditional percentiles and the Gini coefficient. But we're going to begin with the average just to show you this benchmark. So that's exactly what we're showing you here. This is the average effect of a job loss over time. What you have here in the x-axis are the months relative to separation. So -12 means that you're a year before you lose your job. 0 means that's the last month you worked. And 36 means 3 years after you lost your job. On the y-axis, you have the earning loss defined as a share of average wages in January 2010, just to give you a reference, not in money terms, but in percentages. And you have in the red line or horizontal line the value of 0. That would mean the case in which workers that lost their jobs have the similar wage on average that those that didn't. So as you can see, those workers that are about to lose their job have slightly higher wages, around 5%, before losing their job. You see the fall, the sharp fall in the first month of the operation that goes to a total of 40%. Yeah.
Is it monthly wages?
This is monthly wages. So this is monthly wages. Everything is monthly in this database. Yeah. Yeah, you see on average a loss in the first month of separation of 40% of average earnings. By 6 months after separation, you see that the gap is around 10%, 5% when you look at after a year, and you see relatively full recovery. So around here, by a year and a half.
Sorry, I may have missed it, but share of January 2010 wages, so
Yeah.
it's full recovery to that, but there isn't full recovery to their average salary in the last year.
No, that's right. So they do have higher incomes before losing their jobs. They don't recover to that level, they recover to no difference between them, those that lost their jobs and those that didn't. Yeah, so we talk about pre-termination wages, but you're right, this is going back to zero.
Like, another way of saying it, there is a permanent loss.
There is, and if you do this for the Gini, which I mean, I don't have it in the slides, I have it towards the end, you do see that. Very small, but positive increase in inequality over time. That's permanent. That has to do not with the posterior, but the previous period. So to look at how this shapes across the distribution, you can repeat the analysis, not looking at the average, but looking at different percentiles. So this is exactly what I'm showing you here. This is the same figure, but instead of the average, you have 3 percentiles. You have on black here the 10th percentile, so the bottom 10%. You have in yellow the median, the 50th percentile, and in blue you have the 90th percentile. So this is just 3 points in distribution to give you an idea of how this changes across the distribution. If you look at the median in yellow, you see first that the pre-termination wages are equal. There's no increase, there's no difference between them. But you see a median loss of 30% in the first month of separation, and following the average closely, there's a recovery at around a year and a half. If you look at the bottom 10%, you see a much larger loss of going all the way to 90%. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Quick clarification questions.
Yeah.
So, if a person loses his job, so should the income drop to zero? So basically here, I assume that a person may have a multiple jobs. So, he or she loses one job and then, just one sort of income.
Yeah.
So could you if you break it down by the number of jobs that a person may have? And
You mean the number of jobs they have?
some people only have one job, some other may have multiple jobs. So
At the
if they
same
break
time?
it down, then we can see a different distribution, perhaps.
You mean at the same time, right?
Yeah, at the same time.
So that's, yeah, something I got to discuss. We exclude that. So basically, this could be a sort of a problem database. You have few workers, around 6% that have more than one job at the same time, formal job. We established a procedure in previous papers to exclude them. So focus on the main job or the best job. So we are only looking at one job per person per month. But yeah, there are ways to exclude those that have multiple jobs.
Just to follow up on this, so basically one could also interpret this as, okay, the ones at P10, they really become unemployed. So for them, they really don't have a job after they are fired. Whereas the ones that like at P90, they're pretty likely, or there's the majority of the people, but once they're fired, they have a second job lined up. So it's somehow connected to your restrictions of like plus 25% ones like that you exclude.
We can discuss that later. That's actually a good point. We cited on 25% because you do see people switching to jobs where they see an increase of 1, 2, 3, 5%. It's the challenge here is defining what's voluntary. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So if everyone would lose their job and remain unemployed, this would go all the way to 100%.
Because I'm thinking about like this typical unemployment insurance that looks at duration, and you have like these duration models. Whereas you now just translate kind of the share of individuals that find a job right away into that.
This is one way of showing that, how many people find. So yeah, the more people find it. So this is a combination of two things actually. So being unemployed, but also the type of earnings you get once you find a job. So the fact, for example, that the bottom 10% never fully recovers have to do with the fact that they're not only finding jobs, they're finding lower earnings jobs.
Just as a sort of explanatory context, people who lose their jobs in Chile, in terms of the coverage from the actual unemployment system, they have to have contributed for 12 months or for 6 months. But the actual coverage then is quite short in terms of the duration, and also drops quite quickly to a very low replacement rate of about 30%. So if you haven't found a job within about 3 or 4 months, I'd say, you really are down to a very, very low level of replacement rate, at which point, you know, we really have to get the first job that comes along. This was not a system that was ever designed to consider liquidity constraints and to help you find a new good job. This was a system that was designed to prevent moral hazard, not liquidity. There was no consideration of liquidity issues when they designed the system originally.
And we have another paper on that.
So we got two quick clarification questions and we'll move on, and then if there's more discussion, then we can have it at the end. So first there and then.
To account for the fact that some of the people who lose their jobs are getting unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is not there.
No, it's not. One of the motivations was doing that, and we see that because so few people use it, it doesn't make a huge difference. So we have a second paper that's going to explore that.
It doesn't make a difference in between the top and the bottom as well.
It could, but on average, it doesn't.
Sorry.
Yeah, so just to confirm, so basically the income here is like unemployment. Sorry, not unemployment income provided by the government, right? It only their own income.
Only formal income, yes. So for example, if they had formal income, we wouldn't know. Yeah. Sorry, and just to recap, you see at the bottom, very large losses that they never fully recover. On the top, you see somewhat similar losses to the average, which are around 40%, but recoveries are much quicker. So they quickly jump to this zero line. And lastly, just to show you one more graph, this is the similar result, but not over time, but across the distribution. So now what we're looking at here in the x-axis is the earnings percentiles of the distribution, and each line represents a given point in time. So in black, for example, you have the effect 1 month, the first month after separation. In yellow, you have 3 months after separation, and in blue, you have a year after separation. The dashed horizontal lines are the average. So this is the This is the 40% I showed you on average. You see that on average, 3 months after separation, you see losses of around 15%. And after a year, losses are very close to zero, but still negative. So just to recap, what we find here is that there's heterogeneity, particularly at the tails. There's large losses at the bottom, which is what I showed you in the previous slide. But if you look, for example, the top 5%, they are actually not losses, but they are gains. So people, when they switch jobs, they immediately increase a bit their income. In fact, if you look at the blue line, so differences after 1 year, you see that they've increased their incomes by around 10%. So we're seeing at the extremes of the distribution very different labor trajectories. And for the rest of the distribution, particularly if you look at the percentiles 20 all the way to 80, so the 3 middle quintiles, you see not much difference. You see very similar effects, slightly above average. And with that, I'm just going to conclude. As I think I've said way too many times, the average loss is around 40% of the average wage. This is an important wage gap. It's not only about unemployment or finding a job, but we're talking about a long period that has a significant impact on income accumulation because it takes roughly a year and a half to close. There's large differences at the extremes of the distribution. I didn't show you the Gini, but indeed there's a strong short-term effect, an increase in inequality, and there's a low but persistent effect over time. So we still see an increase, although slightly in terms of overall inequality. And we see that in this context, in this dynamics, job losses reinforce earnings inequality, and they sort of create this bad jobs trap in which people at the bottom tend to get stuck. And just more general discussions, these wage gaps are important because they impact savings and assets, not only in terms of the levels, but also in terms of the distribution. So households that have separators, that have people that have lost jobs, will be less prepared for economic shocks. And we see that on the tails, that's quite significant in terms of differences. And that opens the door for compensatory policies, either in the shape of unemployment insurance or of other social protection components. And lastly, this was what we were talking about before. There's a missing dimension here, the fact that we don't know what people are doing once they leave this, the database, the formal employment. So we have lined up future work that would look into the destination of these workers. So they could be actually unemployed, they could be working formally, they could be self-employed. We don't know. And what we want to assess in that line of research is the compensatory role of these alternative forms of employment. So what we see from exploratory analysis is that at least on average, the unemployment insurance doesn't make a huge impact in terms of smoothing out these trajectories. Perhaps this has to do because with the fact that people are using informal work or other sources of income as an alternative compensation. And I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that. So thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Kristen, for the great presentation. So the floor is open for questions. I have a lot of questions of my own, but I'm gonna not take up any of your time. So please feel free to shoot. Chico, please.
Thanks, this is really nice. So the key challenge, of course, as you highlighted, is people leaving the database. You know, it would be very nice to see. Would be like, let's call leaving the database attrition. It would be very nice to see attrition over time by quantile. So, for example, suppose the bottom 10% all go to the informal sector, and you've got 7 people left, right? So you know, so I'd like to see how the change in representative. So it would be wonderful if you plotted that, and the numbers were relatively low and relatively homogeneous.
Yeah.
They're unlikely to be that, obviously. And I don't think you would weaken the paper. I think it's just to show, look, this is what we can do, this is the informal sector. But, you know, how representative, so my guess is the bottom decile, the bottom quantile, which are having all that loss, are also highly selected, because those people are more likely to go to the informal sector. So I think that would be nice. Another suggestion, and then I'll quiet, is following on Hayan and Fabian's questions earlier. I wonder if it's possible. So, you know, these 40% or whatever it happens with the 15%, these are averages. And for each quantile, you're looking across quantiles, is already great. You're looking across quantiles at the origin. But for each quantile at the origin, there's a distribution, right?
After the final job, you mean?
Yeah. So in a sense, there is a joint distribution between origin and destination, destination being T, whichever T you choose. So let's say 10 months or something. Do people in this literature ever look at that? I mean, in samples, probably not easy, but with administrative data, you may have enough data to look at the joint distribution and see, you know, how big that is. Because there's information in the fact that, you know, I'm in the 40th percentile, I'm in the 4th decile at the beginning. A bunch of people lose their jobs, go to 0. A bunch find better jobs, go to 120, right? So it would be very cool to see that joint thing. I don't know if it's done.
I haven't seen that. But yeah, that's definitely interesting. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very nice presentation. So building up on Chico and some other questions. I have 2 questions. One is that if I understand it right, the econometric model, you know, doesn't allow for causal, you know, interpretation, right? Is there some kind of event study type, you know, model where basically you describe, you know, in a very rigorous way, right, the changes over time, following like the job loss event, right? So I think it can be good to make it clearer, you know. Like,
sorry, you had another.
Yes, so that's the first part. Second point, building on that, is that so if that is correct, then is it possible to do some kind of matching, you know, some kind based on, I mean, of course, depending on how rich you know, data is, right? But if it's good, then it can be useful to use some kind of matching based on worker characteristics, so that, you know, we can try to, you know,
that's That's when you run into problems with the database. About the first point, indeed.
Sorry, and then final one. Yeah,
of course.
Final one is that maybe I missed it at some point, but I think that is very interesting that you saw that for the rich, right? The very rich, then actually that job loss event, you know, can be a good thing because basically they have high income, right? So maybe I missed it at some point, but is it like is it job loss something like unexpected? You know, is it something exogenous or people, you know, the richer people, right? The high income worker, right? So is it like intentionally, you know, leave one job and switch, you know, to another high paying job?
Yeah, so that last, thank you for those comments. The last point ties with the causal interpretation of this, right? If you look at, for example, the evidence for the US, they try to look at high unemployment periods, so shocks basically. We don't have that in the period we're studying. In fact, because we're studying right after the Great Recession, but before any sort of shock and in unemployment, we don't have that. That's why we try to deal in some way with the voluntary transitions. So try to exclude them in some way. That's I think the challenge for this paper, at least in that front. And the other one, in terms of matching, the issue with this database is that you don't have a lot of information beyond incomes. So you have contracts income. Very few people report their education, for example. And if you want to know more information, so say why they lost their job, you only have that information for those that made a request to the unemployment insurance, which is a relatively small share. So yeah, it's very limited in additional information.
Yes.
Just directly following up on this, it would be quite nice to understand like who, like, since you say it's a small portion that claims,
Yeah.
but who claims at all and what's kind of the pickup? Just in order to like have that institutional setting a bit more, even though you say it's not that important. It would just be nice to, because you're talking about like there is this system and people are finding jobs and like it's somehow mixed in your measure. So it would be good to
Yeah.
understand that piece of the puzzle as well.
So we have a couple of papers on exactly that. So how the unemployment insurance works in this context. So that we see that that's one of the issues. People, because you have a private saving account and a solidarity fund. That's how it's called. Very few people use the solidarity fund. And that's for two reasons. One is it has a lot of requirements. So typically, if you satisfy the requirements, you don't need it. But if you need it, you don't satisfy the requirements. So it's basically no one uses it in practice.
It's called a catch-22 unemployment insurance system.
Yeah. And yeah, people do use their own savings for that. You can.
But you cannot see this, right? That's not in your.
You can see that, sure, it's a small group, but given the crazy sample sizes, you can actually look at this, at that group in detail.
No, but the only thing you can see is whether they access like the common pot, but not the individual
Both.
savings. Both, you can say both, okay.
So they make a request and then you see, because basically you get first your savings, and then if you run out of savings, the solidarity fund enters into action. So it's a system that's very biased towards private use, so private savings accounts.
Yes, clarification. So this is affiliation, right?
Yes,
And the self-employed are not do not need to be compulsory affiliated.
and they cannot.
Because what we found in Ecuador, following Chico's point, is that we have a lot of attrition at the top from people who were affiliated and then suddenly decide to be self-employed and do not contribute anymore.
Mm.
So in that sense, you might have mixed types of attrition. Might not be at the bottom, might be everywhere. So I wonder whether you might have some information from tax data where, then they have to be there to have an idea of what's going on with that group, to which extent that might impact your results.
Yeah.
And then just a second question was, what about hours of work? So we're talking about monthly earnings, but people might be changing their hours of their flexibility in terms when they lose their job. So we cannot say anything.
No, we cannot say anything about that. We don't have hours. And indeed, I don't know you saw, but when you're at the 0 time frame, so the last month, you also see a decrease. So this is people that were fired in the middle of the month, for example. So their monthly earnings would be half of what they had. So, and we don't know how many days they worked or how many hours they worked. No. And about attrition at the top, we're going to try to do that with the survey, but yeah, I think there's going to be tax data or something.
The problem also with the tax data is that if you're in a country where you try to minimize your tax payments by under declaring your earnings, then the question is how, even if we manage to do that, how reliable would that data be?
Yeah.
And it will still be, I mean, there'd be very few cases.
There's also the issue of good informal jobs. So doctors, for example, moving out of the formal labor force to work on their own and they don't pay tax. So yeah, I mean, we assume that the survey is going to be the best at trying to capture those that are missing from the formal sector.
The survey and the admin data will be matched.
Any other questions? I had one. So like much of my questions were being asked actually over here. I'm somehow linked to this job loss literature. Last month I spent reviewing 2-3 papers and then they have moved to this causal argument quite a lot, saying what is an exogenous job loss, what is involuntary, voluntary. You go at that, but the typical thing that people have used is if they use US literature PSID, there's a direct question. Are you using, like, did you lose your job because your company is closed?
Yeah.
For other reasons and so on. So people have used PSID for that reason. Other countries where they have the register data, administrative data, they could link to employer data and then see whether the employers are, like, whether the firms are closed, plant closures, farm closures, and then they've done it by looking at the let's say 60% of a firm register in the register disappears from one month to the other month, matching the employer so that would be assumed that as exogenous to the individual's characteristics that the job is lost because of that.
Yeah.
Like in the average effect discussions, like what you have done would be easy to flag in journals. But when you look at distributional issues, then all these selection issues that are coming from the top and to the bottom makes it more salient to think about what is voluntary, what is involuntary, because someone could literally interpret this paper saying that, okay, so the people who had somehow luckily get really good jobs ended up like being fired up because they weren't really good. And then they never recovered. They just recovered to enough to be as average workers. Is this a bad thing? Why do we need to have a policy about that? So the like that would be the bottom line of the like other interpretation of the main findings. So to be able to avoid that discussion, you have to make the very clear case that this is somehow involuntary.
Yeah.
And what is in your advantage is that you are saying you had this cutoff of 25% of the earnings increase would be considered as voluntary separations. In the first, I thought that the higher that you make it, selection issue gets worse. But it might be also protective.
It's actually the other way around.
It's actually the other way around. So you make it actually protective to your case. The higher, like you include more of those people.
That's a good point.
And then you have to give a spin to sell that point. That's actually not a bad thing to have a high threshold. But
Oh yeah, that's when we think of a high threshold to exclude those.
I think in your selling, you have to make the case that like the high threshold is protective for the selection from the top, from the bottom. That's my general comment.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? We still have quite a bit of time. No? I wanted to ask one final question because I have taken a bunch of notes if everybody is okay with it. So I just want to use the time since we are here. So one of the issues is about like, and when you are following, it's 50% people that are unemployed and then we don't know the spells. So a few people have covered. After the job loss, we see an average effect of composition effect of people who are ending and entering every month to the workforce. And so that in each time t in an event study setting, that we will have a change in composition.
Yeah.
And in each time t, and when we were having change in composition, it's informative to see what happens to this average group whose composition keeps changing. But it may not be so informative to see their trajectories in terms of like a single person's trajectory, what happens to those people. And if I understand correctly, you have a good setting to say that the short contracts are short anyway.
Yeah.
And then monthly wages or averages are calculated off of a contract-based annual earnings, are they? Or like, we don't know much about
Usually monthly earnings.
So the data registers that. But you have like, I mean, I don't know how it works. I need the contextual information from you. I get a job offer and they're giving me a job offer. A contract says like your annual salary will be this much.
It's monthly in the case of Chile.
And then it's always monthly.
Always.
Yeah.
And then that is registered as the annual. And then
There's no, I mean, workers would not know their annual salary. They'd have to work it out with a calculator.
great. So then annual salaries do not change also by the contract, right? So like if you have a 1-year contract, you will have the monthly, every month you're going to have the same salary. So so the trajectory will only happen if they change a contract or update in the contract. And every time you have a change in contract, you have to re-register this into the system. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so if you want to look at whether this job loss is a good thing for their lifetime earnings, so you could actually do that because within the you can observe the same person's multiple contract changes.
Yeah.
And that might be one way to avoid all of that causal literature, to give an extra meat to the paper, to say like, it's not only the earnings distribution in a snapshot because of the compositional changes, but it's also on their lifetime earnings inequality.
Yeah.
Might have been changing. So that's one way to expand the paper, perhaps in a direction maybe you didn't want to go.
No, that's not the point. It's just that because the data only matures after about 2010, it's really difficult to extrapolate this to lifetime earnings. And also we know from surveys that we have done, like cohort studies with survey data, that people are only contributing to these systems for about 40%, 50% of their working lifetime.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's hard to. We could look at it when we look at the survey data. We could look at this with a little bit more detail because that goes back further. But how reliable that is, these are the sorts of countries where this is already, you know,
Right.
the fact that we know this and we can work this out is already a huge, huge step.
Yeah.
But the actual proportion of the labour market that we're looking at here relative to the total workforce is actually quite small. And I mean, to me, that, you know, one of the most interesting questions is actually what's going on with those people who are not in this distribution and the ones who are sort of permanently rotating between one job and another.
Right.
Yeah, how do they move? But that's a separate paper.
Can we say that then what you find here is then the upper bound of
It's
whatever the
the-
earning inequality? So that, because we have seen the good jobs that are already registered, and then once you lose those jobs, recovery takes a while and then it's not full recovery. And then the earnings inequality that is generated because of the job losses out of these good jobs should be an upper bound, because if you include other ones, or like the ones that are on the bottom end, goes and the recovery must be much longer, and then you will have a lot of zeros in your distribution, which would boost up the inequality.
Yeah, there was a reason why we excluded those jobs that had a duration of less than 12 months. And we didn't look at that group separately.
Yeah, I mean, there are several issues with this data. One of the points you mentioned on people switching contracts, or say within the same company, that could also be because companies change you. So basically, we had something called multi-root at some point, where companies switched you within their company to different branches. So they wouldn't have to pay so any sort of benefit after working 1 year. So you also have that in the data, which is not a voluntary change in contract, but something you really don't notice, because your wage is not changing, but you're getting paid by different branches of the same company. It's less of an issue now, but anyway, I think Joaquin had a comment.
Sorry.
It's like if you work for Marks and Spencer and Marble Arch is a different tax ID to the one in wherever, and then they rotate you between jobs. So with that category of jobs, it's really hard to really know what's going on.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. So we have Joaquin on the.
Yes.
Yeah. Joaquin.
Only some comments. I think that one of the contribution of this paper is to see the job loss in the economic literature in all the earning distribution, and this has two consequences. First, you can talk with the theory to explain why people have some loss in the future earnings, because you can find in this paper that you can increase your future wage or decrease depending where part of the distribution you are, and all the theory that we found is related with the average, and I think that is very interesting to know about that. And the other contribution is to connect the job loss in a formal sector with the literature of inequality. So, for example, when we have read the background related with the paper, we didn't find a theory that explains both sides of the coin. Why some people increase the future or the future wage or decrease, and I think that that's it's some people some comments to integrate the theory in. It's good for our paper. So this is my
Thank you so much, Joaquin. We have Diane Dyson asking a question. What is relation of income groups to job precarity? Lowest income percentile most likely to work short-term jobs.
I mean, that's the case in fact in our sample. So if you look at fixed-term workers, they have lower incomes, but at least for the purpose of this analysis, we're excluding most of them because of the duration restriction. But yeah, that's true. Fixed-term contracts have lower incomes on average.
Do we have any further questions, Chico? Yeah.
Just on something you said, what was you said it was the upper bound of what?
So I was asking the speakers whether the estimation that we find on earnings inequality, can it be interpreted as upper bounds of earnings inequality? What, like if we had the data, like for the full labor force, and agreement was, yes, it can be the upper, it's actually upper bound.
Are you sure about that? I mean, for example, what this last question just asked, if those people were in there, the earnings inequality probably would be bigger.
The level of inequality, yes, but I'm not sure about the changes due to.
What, the upper bound on what? On the change in inequality or on the level?
I would say on the change in inequality because of the job loss. Because they are finding the job losses on the best jobs where the drop should be more dramatic than the jobs that where initial levels were not as high. When you lose the job and you're almost like earning loss is nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the type of transitions they have. So if they have very low earnings, they lose their job and they end up with this basically the same earnings, it wouldn't have an effect on inequality or not within the group. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what's.
One thing I don't know, you know, upper bound over what possible. If you include the informal sector,
yeah,
I would be very hesitant to make any statement about upper bound. You just don't know what's happening in this.
Yeah, no, at least within the formal sector, but yeah.
I'm just saying I'm not being agnostic about
Okay.
bounds in this.
And I was trying to push the authors to give some sort of a quantification that how much we should care about that final inequality in numbers and whether we can make a statement. So
And I missed this, so you don't have whether it's quits or fires and separate.
No.
Only if you made a request to the unemployment insurance.
If you make a request, you have to have been fired. You can't get funds if you.
Oh, that's the one, but a lot of people don't make
That's
As it's a minute percentage.
that.
but you could actually see the closures of firms.
yeah, that's so yeah.
That's the most exogenous thing that you can
You have
find.
firms ID, you don't know which companies are they, but you could look at those that disappeared, for
Yeah,
example.
so assign a threshold. What are the workforce for that firm in the firm ID?
Yeah,
Loses their employers in a given month and then
yeah, definitely.
match that with the workers and then say that job displacement because of the firm's closure. That's the,
Yeah.
Years from now, you can use.
yeah.
That's all over. Thing, yeah.
Because this, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, because this data is on employment that comes from an unemployment insurance system. We relate the results to unemployment. But if this data were not from an unemployment insurance system, but let's just say from a pension system, where you wouldn't have all of this information, I'm just wondering to what extent we need to engage with the unemployment insurance debate, because really, so we've been having this conversation between ourselves, and really we just wanted to do a paper on job losses and earnings inequality, disregarding most of the characteristics of the unemployment insurance system because we didn't consider them to be so relevant for this paper. But because the data comes from an unemployment insurance system, it seems like those are the questions that keep on coming up. So I think we need to rethink.
Yeah, so I think much of the questions, my reading of the room, everyone can interpret or interject whether my interpretation is correct, is this understanding of job loss, like as itself as an action, whether your treatment variable is voluntary versus involuntary. If it's bad performance workers on the bottom 10% of the firms that are being fired up, so that's like as a shock to their earnings is something that we should care or not care at all, because you make the case about the policy implications. And it's separately from where the data is originated from, whether pension system or an unemployment insurance system. It's both an identification issue and it's a policy implication issue, whether we care about doing something about those people or let them be.
Yeah.
Or so.
But you still need to, I mean, from a public policy perspective, you still want them to work and hopefully in the best job possible. But there may be a reason, for example, if they're young workers and they're just not qualified enough or trained enough, then that's where your public policy comes in.
That's right. So I recently reviewed 2 papers for a special issue in labor economics, literally two weeks ago. They were looking at the same design, but looking at the gender wage gap.
Mhm.
And they were looking at like demographic factors of who's actually moving and then dropping these, but they were using Scandinavian register data sets. One was Austria and so on. So again, global north. But I mean, it's easier to make the case that distributional arguments are affecting gender wage gap for the policy discussion or like certain demographics like youth unemployment and other things. But if you're just looking at agnostically on the distribution in general, then the question is, what if they are just bad performing workers? They're losing their jobs, and on the bottom, and the top is not doing so bad, and they were like mismatched anyway in the first place in the labor market, and then they were going to be losing at some point at every time.
In which case you want to help rematch them. But there's also this fact that we're always sort of dealing with, which is the fact that this is still really a developing country, even though it's officially classified as developed, with all the institutions and mechanisms that are particular of a developing country. And so, for example, a lot of this rotation is coming from the fact that employers don't want to accrue severance pay rights, for example. And so a lot of the job rotation is actually produced by this, which in a developed country wouldn't be the case. And in Chile, it's just like, you know, written into the DNA of employers that you don't want to have workers there for too long a time, or if they get too old or whatever. So there are lots of reasons that are very specific to a developing country.
That's right.
And Latin America as well.
Which is an excellent selling point.
Which is really hard to then, you know, unwrap with data, because only the people who claim unemployment benefits are supposed to fill in a questionnaire which would give us access to all of this data. And then, of course, half the time they don't. So
Right, I think that's a great selling point as you started with that premise. I think that's a great advantage for the paper, and I applaud for the great work. I think this is the time that we finish the meeting. So thank you so much for everyone for the question.